Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final session in this week's virtual conference, Making Data Good for Society. My name is Julian Schwarzenbach. I'm chair of the BCS Data Management Specialist Group, and I'm being assisted today by Mark. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
I'm Mark Humphries. I'm the chairman of DAMA UK.
So hopefully you've sat in on at least one or two of the webinars and presentations we've had during this week. We've had an excellent selection. We've had, I don't think we've had any that are classed as a miss. They've all been definite hits. And so we're sort of ending the week with the panel debate. But just a quick reminder, we've had journalism working with us throughout the week. They've been providing visual references to all the presentations and Q&A sessions. So they've actually been really useful to have on board. So on the image on the screen, we started off with the National Data Strategy with Phil Earle, then Neil Crump, and Neil's just joined us there. Hi, Neil, from NHS. We then had Millie Zamita from the ODI, and Carly Redhead and this colleague, but they were from the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap project. Karen Alford did her session on Wednesday morning, followed by Mark Enzer in the afternoon. So that was two presentations around the built environment. Catherine O'Keefe did the session on ethics yesterday morning, followed by Stuart Kitney from the National Physics Laboratory. And then this morning we had Nick Soros from DataKind. So we've had a really good run of presentations this week. Just a very quick reminder, if you've not come across it before, during the conference, we've been having a discount from the BCS bookshops. There's 30% discount on a variety of data-related books. Early in the week, I must admit, I'd forgotten to put the actual code up, so I told people about the offer but missed the code. The code is there now on the slide. So it is BCS Data, and that gives you 30% off various data-related titles. We are recording this session. It will be going up on the BCS Member Group's YouTube channel. It will also be going up on the DAMA website as and when we have processed it. And also journalism, as well as having done the original visual agenda, they will be doing a visual representation of this and a follow-on as well. We've got you all muted, but we're interested in having an interesting Q&A session. We've already got a few questions to start the process going. But by all means, please use the chat session to add in any questions that you might have for the panel. Just to pre-warn, Nick unfortunately has to leave us in about half an hour, but that's for plenty of time to at least explore a few of the data-related areas that we've got here at the moment. So I think that's probably it for the housekeeping. I will stop sharing. And Mark, do you want to kick off with the first question?
Certainly. So the theme of the conference has been making data good for society. What do you believe are the key factors in getting benefits from data? And I'm going to ask that question first to Karen, please.
Getting the benefits from data. I think if I reflect on where we are, where I've come from, and I think we are now moving into the era of thinking about data in its wider extent. I think for many of the years that I've sort of been in this industry, we tended to very much focus on reporting and dashboards and those sorts of things. I think now we're moving into that era where data is king, and we can get so much greater value out of the data and the technology that we now have to really get to a better understanding of it. And I think from a business perspective, that's providing many more opportunities, those opportunities that we never thought we could ever do. It just seemed to be an impossible task. Suddenly we can begin to see our way through in getting that a better place.
Okay, thank you very much. Nick, what are your thoughts on this one?
Cool. So I'm putting my DataKind hat on. We at DataKind, as I mentioned in the presentation, we use a framework called data maturity. So I think for us, we truly believe that the key to using data effectively within a charity, but it also extends to other organizations, is to have a data mature organization. But if I sort of take my DataKind hat off for a second, there are two particular areas of the data maturity that actually speak to my experience, which is the leadership. So for me, you need to have the leadership buying and understanding of data in order for this to work, because even if you have a data team that is doing excellent work with or without dashboards, with or without machine learning, if the people at the top don't understand the value of it, things will either not be used or not propagated. And the other one is culture. So trying to build a data culture within an organization. So either training people on how they can use data, enabling them to use the data of the organization through, for example, self-serve solutions, asking the right questions, showing them what's possible. That can be key, because these are the stakeholders a lot of us are dealing with. So if a data team is going to another team and sort of tries to pitch or tries to implement an idea that they have, it will only really get the organization will only really get most of the value if there is a certain data culture within the organization itself.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Stuart.
So I absolutely agree with Nick from seeing data as a trusted and valued asset, and the roles and responsibilities that are required to help support and deliver that. But I would take a step back, and I think I probably pushed the point quite significantly yesterday around confidence in data. So I think there's a real need and requirement to understand the provenance of the data, where it's come from, how it's been captured, what method was used to generate that data, and was it fit for purpose for what the data set was collected for. So very much from my perspective, the way we look at things is to provide that confidence. You've got to actually understand and trust the measurement modality or the sensor or the action of the machine that generated the data, to be able then to actually use it to its full value and trust its provenance, because it's very easy for us to want to work and transform into digital organizations and believe that we're getting value from the data and the data sets that we use. But the reality is that we could be making poor decisions on the back of the data that we have access to if we don't truly understand its provenance, where it's come from and how fit for purpose it is. So I think a key aspect for me and the area that I work in is really around this fit for purpose data and the traceability of it and the provenance that the data has.
Okay, thank you very much. Neil, would you like to add your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and one that's close to my heart. We've been working to get the right people into our organisation to make it happen. So we've created a couple of roles, data relationship managers and data coach. And the whole point is around collaboration and driving better conversations. So really the focus on people means that we can then have those conversations around the problems that we need to solve, and COVID has provided those in unlimited amount of variety, and so that's one aspect. I think it's also been touched on around tooling as well. One thing that we've learned over the last sort of few months is that if we give people the right modern type of tools, then that can save a lot of time. So we've been giving people the ability, for example, to use low code techniques to do the machine learning, which then gives a lot more time to have the better conversation, because there's less time actually spent manipulating the data and more time having conversations, so that you can actually then take the decisions and the actions and get the outcomes that you're looking for.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's really useful, Neil, and it kind of leads in really nicely to the next question we got lined up, which was really looking at whether whether the panel believe that an organisation could succeed in today's environment if they don't have a chief data officer or don't have a data manager, somebody leading and providing that focus. So I don't know who wants to start on this one. Stuart, I mean, what are your thoughts on the essential need for a CDO or a data manager?
I think these roles are absolutely key. I think this ownership and responsibility of the data that an organisation holds, there has to be that overall accountability as to data structures, how it's used, what tools are being applied, the ownership of the data. And I think every organisation should be implementing these roles. The stewards down at the localised level as well, particularly if you've got domain-specific expertise that is required. So if you work in broad fields, then there are commonalities across generic data sets, but actually when you get down into science research, like my background is, then there's a real need and requirement not just to have this CDO type role that has got that overarching accountability and responsibility for data, but actually down to the localized level as well. These roles are key. So there's just that point of reference in terms of ownership of data specific to application areas, and we see these roles being key for digital transformation within organisations.
Yeah, that's good. And Karen, what are your thoughts?
I think it's essential actually, because I have that type role, and I ask all the awkward questions. I think sometimes it's very easy to be, think, a piece of IT or a piece of technology can do everything for you. But if you don't have good data going in, you don't understand that it's fit for purpose, that it's going to be that it's joinable is at the other end, then actually the technology isn't going to bring the benefits that you're expecting. And sort of picking up a point that was mentioned earlier, I've been on this afternoon, we have a change board where we actually discuss, how we're going to join up the data as it's being created. So not at the end, but actually working out where it's coming from, its provenance, its definition, its structures. And I think, this is, something that we didn't do before, but it's very essential if we are going to be moving and driving a digital future.
Yeah, and Nick, your thoughts about the role of the data manager and the CDO?
I don't know if I would call them a data officer or data management, but it speaks to the point I was making previously that the leadership part is very important. So having someone in a leadership role, in my opinion, is very helpful. Because otherwise, you need to have some champion within the organization. It's just that champion is going to be an informal role that with limited ability to enforce things that need to happen. I think another thing that we might see is a transition towards that reality, which is that some organizations, data are more important. And to a certain extent, we're seeing those roles in some places where data is playing a role. Until the data officer executive role becomes something that most organizations have. I think it's going to start from the places where data is more of an asset at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess from Neil's perspective, that's the kind of role that you are fulfilling at the moment, is that person in the middle, joining all the dots. Just be interested from an NHS perspective, or in terms of your particular situation, is that a role that's been around for a long time, or is it one that's recent, and is it now established such that if you were to move on to bigger and better things, that there will naturally be somebody identified and lined up to succeed you, Neil?
The last year has absolutely changed the way data is used across all types of organizations. The NHS absolutely understands the power of data. I agree with Nick around the leadership aspect of it. What we're looking to do is create leaders across the whole organisation in lots of different roles that take data seriously. So although you could have a focal point, we have to be clear in the NHS that a lot of what we do is about clinical improvement, patient safety, etc. So some of those, I think it can sit differently in different places and different organizations. depending on where you are within the NHS as well. So in a hospital, absolutely, you'll need someone leading so that you can make the best out of operations and the best out of clinical activity. In primary care, around GPs, it's unlikely that you're going to have a chief data officer, for example, and therefore you're going to require some way of filling that void, because they're not going to be able to make someone dedicated to that role. So I think in those examples, you probably look to combine digital and data together, and that's how you will get that leadership. So I don't think there's one size fits all. However, I think what the NHS absolutely does know is the power of data and the require for leadership.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
Okay, so we've covered leadership there, and I think Neil sort of hinted at beyond leadership and in terms of the rest of the organisation using data and getting the most value out of it. And this is a subject which is very close to my heart in terms of how you actually get people using data, understanding it, and actually making best use of it in their day-to-day jobs, which sort of hints at data literacy and data awareness. So, what are the panel's thoughts on how we go about raising data awareness and data literacy? How might we affect change, that sort of cultural change and educational side of things? And we'll start, I think this time we'll start with Stuart.
A fantastic question, and one that we really grapple with in a research and development background. And one of the ways that we're looking to really address this challenge is to try to refocus the way scientists think about data. So historically, your career has been very much built upon peer-reviewed publications, your H-index score, how you're viewed around your peer network in terms of your scientific output. But what's becoming more and more prevalent and important is reproducibility around science and providing your data, your base data sets alongside publications. So using internationally recognized repositories, making that data openly accessible and available, abiding by all of the FAIR principles. And the value that brings is that it changes the mindset that switches the scientists to thinking about the data and the data set that's provided being just as important, and if even more so than the actual research publication. And the reason that's so important is that then will build an inherent want and need to make sure that data is curated in a fit and proper fashion, because if we're going to improve scientific reproducibility, then those data sets are key for people to then lean upon. So we're not in a situation where we're replicating science that's gone before, and we can actually build on the work of others. And I think when we get to a position where the data is valued like that, then peer-reviewed publications will become the secondary output. I think it will be all about your data sets and how you've produced and what tools you've used. And I think that would be a massive culture change within science research field. I think once we get there, then that will really develop and change a culture, and it will build leadership, because our future scientific superstars will be built upon the data sets that they've developed through their experimental knowledge, as much as through how they've published their research and results.
That's very interesting, and see, especially with you being in a that scientific environment, where a very data-rich environment, quite mature, I can see how that would, building into people's objectives and their annual appraisal cycle would work. I'm going to switch over to Nick now from the from the social sector. I imagine that would be wouldn't be in a position to put it right into people's objectives. So, what are your thoughts from your side of the equation in terms of improving data literacy and data awareness?
I think this is a very important question. It speaks also to my personal career, but in terms of charities and data kind, again, it is why we use the data maturity framework. Essentially, the one point that I mentioned in my presentation, that data kind is trying to sort of make a contribution towards in regards to data literacy, is making the case. It's the same thing we do when I join an organization that is not data literate, but it's the same thing we do with data kind and data types. We're trying to offer an example, a good, strong example of how data can assist the charity. And I would say that's definitely one of the things that need to happen, making the case, offering lots of examples, increasingly so, that are important. Of course, in my career, again, switching hats, I've also had to do the educational piece. So I wasn't shy from speaking into the organization, which I think is also important, not only on how they can use the tools that they have, but also, what's possible and, what are these new technologies. But if I were to actually forget those two, which I think are some things that need to happen, I think the most important thing is something I mentioned earlier, which is self-serve analytics. So essentially trying to enable everyone at the organization answer questions with the data themselves. Otherwise, they're always going to be a blocker for everyone, or they're going to be relying on these reports that someone is producing for them. For me, the one thing that is life-changing in an organization, which I've seen in a couple of places I worked, was to enable people to answer their own questions, which leads to more questions, which needs for more advanced things that they cannot do, and they ask for other teams to do, either internally or externally. So this is where I would put my money.
Okay, great, thank you. So Karen, you talked about leadership at the Environment Agency and your role there. Again, are there challenges in the Environment Agency with raising data awareness and data literacy?
Absolutely. I think any traditional organisation with thousands of employees, it is a challenge. And sort of part of our approach, I mean, we do have to change that hearts and minds. So, and it's being able to engage with people, but it's also making data more available to them. So we have, for instance, we've been working on looking at how we can create the single version of the truth. So thinking about the things that we can do behind the scenes to deliver data in a more consistent way, standardized way, to different tools. So where people go, they get the same version of the truth. We've also been thinking about sort of standard dashboards that are available on our GIS platforms to answer simple questions, standard questions, because I believe if we can begin to take some of the mundane, I have to go away, I have to generate a report to get the information I need to do my everyday job, then we cannot then free up the time for them to better understand their data, deal with the data quality issues, and start, as Nick was mentioning, starting to do the more exciting things, because we are expecting them to just do the mundane. So the more we can remove the mundane, give them good data they can trust and rely on, then that, for me, that's part of the culture. What's been really quite interesting, because we do open up quite a bit of our data, there is a realization that our data is not just used by us, which as an industry, as a business, it's quite, suddenly you can tap into Google and you can find the same information that you can if you tap into the asset management system. That can be scary to people, but it does drive that. Actually, I do have a role in making sure this data is good.
Great, thank you. Neil, you mentioned that there's a high degree of data literacy within the NHS, that the NHS really gets data and understands the value of it. So I'm going to twist the question slightly for you, because, and I think a very topical subject right now is the idea of pooling and sharing health data, and you've got the NHS is very much there for the public good. We all, as citizens and patients, have a role, have a stake in the NHS and in our own healthcare data. To what extent do you feel that the conversation is what direction do you feel the conversation is going in terms of data awareness with patients and with citizens when it comes to healthcare?
Yeah, so far we have probably not exchanged data with citizens as much as we will do in future. Well, I know that's the case, and that's a real ambition for us, and a real aspiration is to get the data into the hands of citizens so that they can actually participate more in their own health. So we have to remember, though, where we've come from. So traditionally, there's been a very paternalistic way of providing health to people. and the way that the culture within an organization on sometimes what is quite a technical and difficult subject, and the notes that have been kept have been in a language that perhaps is only understandable if you've had many, many years of training. So what we need to do now is work out how we can share data and insight in a very easy and accessible way where people can take meaning from it and use that to actually improve their own health. And the way that we're going to do this is not release all of the data around someone's health. It's to be able to release really important bits of data that people, and put that in a context where people can understand. An example might be diabetes, for example, which hits a huge amount of our population. So it's what important points around the diabetes pathway can we share back to the patient so that they can get control of their own health. However, there are so many different subjects we could talk about, long-term conditions, etc. And I think each of them comes with their own intricacies. And that's why we'll work on some of the most important ones after talking to citizens, and we'll ask them, what's most important to you? And by doing that, we'll co-produce together, and we'll start showing the data more than we've done in the past.
Sounds like a huge challenge, and well, yeah, something that will go on for years and it will continually evolve. Okay,
it will.
Yeah. I think it's interesting how all these answers, it wasn't deliberate. The questions we got sorted out were sort of kind of all flowing into each other really neatly. And your answer there, Neil, I think leads very neatly into the next one, which was actually based on partly on Karen's presentation on Wednesday, where I think we've all been in environments where people see organizations, they will spend money on a technology fix. You might be spending a lot of money on a technology fix, and they kind of forget the data. And actually building up the foundations of getting the data right first is fundamental to a lot of what we're trying to do. And I think Karen, what you presented is the Environment Agency have very definitely been on that journey of getting the fundamentals right to build on top of those solid foundations. But what I'm interested to do is actually, how do you have any tips on selling that message of getting the data bits right first before getting carried away with the sexy technology? Karen, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, it would help if I was unmuting on the right button. If I sort of share a little story of my journey, what was really interesting is actually we had some really quite good data standards, but they were in a document and they weren't very accessible. So part of our sort of governance process says, you have data standards, and those data standards are reflected in your sort of IT systems and technologies, but no one really knew they existed. So technically they did, but they didn't. So part of the activity I've been leading is making them more visible, making them more accessible, making them API readable, machine readable, as standards in their own right. And that has led to, we understood how we'd humanized things as well. So how we had called the same thing, different in different ways. So one, it was, I'm talking about assets here. So, so we'd called the same physical structure something different, depending on the asset family we were talking about, and all those sorts of things. But most importantly, as we start on this journey, is making sure the data is fit for purpose and actually fit for all purposes. So what we did, and I'm sure many businesses do, is we did tend to focus on the outputs, the reporting and the outputs, without understanding the inputs. And the problem is, because we didn't think about the inputs, we often ended up comparing apples with pears, and then wondering why we couldn't get the results, or why we couldn't answer what on the face of it was really simple questions. And it was because we had never thought about how the data fits together at the beginning, and making sure that we're collecting and producing data that has the appropriate definitions and data quality parameters at the start. So and what has been really useful is we have our online library, environment. If you tap into Google Environment Agency DRL, you can come to our data requirements library, and that has just been enormously useful. So many people are using it for different purposes, because just creating the visibility of how we describe, well, some of our data anyway, as a starting point has been really key.
Yeah, good, thank you. Nick, I know you've got to leave shortly, so this is probably the last answer you give us, but any tips for you from you about selling that message about getting the data fundamentals right?
You're right. I wanted to jump in and say I need to leave, but I do have time to answer this. So I guess my experience, so my expertise is machine learning. So I'm going to offer that example, which we've seen both in DataKind and I've seen in my personal experience. In machine learning in particular, or if you want to use, let's say, more advanced data science, there are a lot of times where organizations think, because they have a lot of data, say that being documents or a large collection of unstructured data, that they can actually go on and do other things they've seen their competitors or online. But the amount of times that they come in, but they don't have a particular target in mind, so labeled data essentially in the jargon of data science, is amazing. So maybe they've spent like 2 years collecting that data that they thought they would hand over to a data scientist, and sort of magic would happen. But then all of which is, and then sort of hearing that, they need to spend so many months to actually produce the data they need to do what they want, because what they have is not helpful. Yeah,
so it's dispelling the myths and the data science isn't data magic, that you still got to get fundamentals right. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, thank you, Nick. Appreciate you've got to go now. So thank you for your input so far. It's been really, really useful.
I'm really sorry that I have to go. The conversation is super interesting, so I'm going to miss it, but thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Nick. Neil, just wondered about you in terms of, your previous answer there was very much about trying to get the basics right. Any challenges selling that into the health service? So to slightly paraphrase and slightly, to avoid people getting the idea of the machine that goes ping, we'll spend money on that, rather than actually getting the fundamentals right.
Yeah, so I suppose a couple of things. One, we're starting to use what we call kite marks. So that's a stamp of data quality as such, and that will be for some of the reasons that Karen articulated, so people can be confident in the report they're using. A second thing, and this comes from the central NHS, and that's been widely used now within the local trusts, and that's the thing called SPC, which is the statistical process controls. And what that does is, within our performance reporting, it allows us to be able to show clearly where a situation might be deteriorating or if a situation is improving, and it just therefore allows you to put some reliability and control in your analysis, basically. So that absolutely is a way that makes it easier for people to understand sometimes quite complex reports, because it's got that ability where you can immediately see if there are outliers, and so you don't misinterpret the data.
Yeah, and so there's a need there for the people creating the reports just to think carefully about how they present the results, as well as the kite mark. They'll be able to not filter out the outliers, but maybe make sure they're still there, and somebody can use human inference to work around what that might represent.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Stuart, what about you about selling the fundamentals, getting the underlying basics right to avoid the need for data magic?
I absolutely recognise all of the answers, all very good answers provided so far. So simplifying processes, just making it easier to understand what the standards are that you expect of people within your organisation, dispelling the myths that it's not a magic solution, particularly at an executive level or more broadly across the organisation outside the domain specific science research that's taking place. making sure that people see the value of getting the fundamentals right to start with. So a good example for us would be multimodal imaging. So different groups working on different imaging platforms at different measurement scales, just understanding that that data being interoperable and shareable across those groups creates far more value as a collective than it does them working in individual pockets, and really strengthens the data that's been created if they're taking into account those fundamental principles of the quality of data that is being created. And just one final point, I think, that speaks to the explainability challenge. Just making sure that for the non-expert that you've thought about how the data is communicated, how it's visualized, and coming back to Neil's brilliant previous answer is that, so if the data is going to be shared with patients in the future, not only do you have to make a decision about what data you choose to share, but how are you communicating it in a way that is actually visually easy for them to understand, and is done in a way that doesn't create more mistake and more uncertainty, and actually dispels myths around the data, but actually clearly articulates to them what it means for their own personal health. And I think just understanding how it's interpreted and visualized at the end is really key and important as well.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah,
Mark?
certainly. I think it's an interesting question which we've been, sort of asking for years. This one about technology versus data, and from my own personal experience, before we move on to the next question, I think, and this may be just because of the people I've been speaking to in the last couple of years, but I get the impression that a lot of people have moved on from I can solve my problems by dropping technology in, and a lot of the conversations I have these days often start with, we've got all the technology we need, okay, but the data is the problem. How do we get the data right? And like I say, it may be that I'm having, I'm in a self-selected group because people tend to want to talk to me because they've already heard about DAMA first of all. No, I'm optimistic that actually the conversation has moved on, and people are looking, specifically at data and how they use it, how they share it, how they make sense of it, and so on. So I'm optimistic on that one. So moving on to the next question then. Data scientists, they have been for a while portrayed as, maybe not quite the next shiny piece of software, but certainly the rock and roll solution, that the guys who are going to solve all your data problems. Been attract a lot of attention. But they're often the first to admit they don't exist in a vacuum. There are other data roles, other data skills that are needed to actually make everything work nicely. So what would the panel say are the other really important roles in the data world at the moment? And let's start with Karen this time. Oh, sorry, you're on mute again, Karen.
Sorry, I have a speaker's phone and it popped on. I think for me, what some of the other roles that we need to think about is definitely the people that have the skills to define and understand data, how it joins together. So not so much about how we get results out, but how we can make it fit for all purposes. And that, for me, is very much a growing skill. And I'm thinking particularly with some of the work that I've been doing and Julian has been doing, making your data interoperable and making your data marry up with openly available standards. So particularly in the construction and asset management industry, realizing that we need to join up with these other organizations and contribute to those discussions have been really quite key. I think as well, thinking about the analytics. So because I think data scientists, actually they're there to do something over and above what we have done as a business. But within a business, having people with good data skills, the basic analytical skills, I think for many businesses where we are fitting at the moment.
Okay. I'll go to Neil next. In terms of how do you see the skills landscape evolving? What other skills are important besides data science?
Yeah, so to Karen's point around people understanding, that's why we introduced the data relationship manager, data coach, really important to sort of improve that literacy. The other area we've definitely been investing in is the engineering. So how we automate we've got a lot of different applications within the NHS and within the running of a hospital, and in order to bring those different data sets together and to do that in an efficient way, in an affordable way, we need those data engineers who can bring, using standards, etc., the data together. So that's another key role for us, and one that we've invested in, and will probably, I could see that over the next 2 or 3 years, really increase the investment as we bring digital and data together. So we talked about those digital tools that we capture the data, then we're going to have to automate that data and take it to different sources.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Stuart, as a data scientist, what roles do you see that are needed to support you and to enable you, if you like, to do what you need to do?
So I think one of the key ones is the data engineers, and in effect the plumbing of the pipelines that go from the work that's done within data science to that end use application. I think that's absolutely key, and I agree with Neil on that. But I'd come at it from a different perspective a little bit. So we would probably think very much more of the end user and multi-skilled expertise and experience that's needed and required. So I think we need to put more emphasis on skills and training and education of people that may be a clinician, a pathologist, but is actually now being asked to use and apply machine learning algorithms or understand what quantitative imaging is and how AI is going to interact to help support them make clinical decisions. And then you've got that challenge in many, many fields. And I think we're now in a position where we need to give more emphasis on the rock stars need to become the people that actually apply the tools, that work alongside the data scientists, that are making the in-field decisions with the tools and the data sets and the data curation that's been developed and built upon to make real world decisions, so that all of this work has actually got real application. And I think more emphasis needs to be put on the end user and the skills that are required and needed. I think the education system's still very much steeped in, if you want to become a medical doctor, that's the route you go down. If you want a mathematician, you do maths, physicist. And I think we need to be starting to think more about cross-disciplinary skill sets, because that's where all of this work that we're doing in data science actually ends up having real world application and brings value.
I think I'll also add in that I think one of the underappreciated skills, and it's actually quite a rare skill set, are the people who can help pull your data requirements together. So they need to have enough domain understanding to be able to talk intelligently with the experts. They need to have enough data understanding to be able to understand how the data is going to be used. But then they also need to have some negotiation skills to arbitrate between the different viewpoints in the organization. And that's actually quite a rare skill set that I don't think is always appreciated. And if you don't get that right, then you can't get the quality criteria right, then you can't assess whether your data is any good or not. And that's almost like the start of the sausage machine, is getting those requirements right. So yeah, so I think it's an underappreciated skill set there, definitely.
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
I'd say there's even a repeating pattern, Julian, that anyone who can communicate with two different communities, two different groups within an organization, have enormous value, enormous importance in the role.
Yeah, so being the translators between different parties. Yeah. Which actually leads into a nice question that Tim King has put through of, so I think for a lot of the Ubers and the Amazons of this world, I think most people recognize that they've got a model that's very data driven, that actually drives the success of what they do. And yet for many more traditional inverted commas organizations, they're trying to go through that data journey, they're trying to get data enabled, but very often they're struggling. So what do you think the success factors might be to actually become a properly to do that digital transformation from a more traditional organization? So I'll start with Stuart and we'll go to Karen, then with Neil, who's probably got the most, if not the most traditional organization there. Stuart, what do you think?
It's a great question, and it is a real challenge. So I think the first question you should be asking is, do you need that digital transformation? I think we'd probably all accept to survive in the cyber physical world, then yes, you do. But I think there's a tendency to believe that because Amazon and Uber and Google have got this business model, then we have to follow a similar path and work in similar sort of methods and systems. And I think sometimes there needs to be a realization of, what are you trying to achieve? What aspects of your organization has to be digital because it's critical, and if you don't do it, you cease to exist. What can be built on a longer time frame and is acceptable to take a slower pace, and what doesn't need to be? What actually doesn't have longevity in a digital world that you just need to maximize the ability of that service, that product, that way of working? I think sometimes you, instead of this jump to be fully digital transformed as an organization, I think there's maybe needs to be a bit of realism, because this isn't an easy journey. I think those companies have all got a competitive advantage because they were built and started on the whole premise of being digitally focused, data focused and data structured. Traditional organizations are not, and I think there needs to be a bit of realism about how achievable it is, on what timescales, what the cost is going to be, and then where you prioritize.
Yeah, so it's evolution rather than revolution,
Exactly.
and being critically clear about which areas you need to transform and automate. Karen, your thoughts?
I think it's a really interesting one, and I sometimes pose the question, if we were starting today, how would we do it? Because I think that one of the challenges with traditional businesses, if you think about it, we translated human ways of doing things into computers, but actually we were limited by the amount of people and the computing power. And very easily you can slip into continuing that journey and not actually stop and say, right, how would I do it today? What is the type of data that's available? What data am I managing that actually I could get from an open source? And I think that's part of the thinking that needs to go ahead. Obviously, you can't just throw out everything that you've done, but you've got to support people and sort of freeing up their thoughts and ideas about what they've always done, and then start filling those gaps. For me as well, thinking about particularly how we can reduce the mundane activities, and I sort of take Stuart's point. I think, for me, digital transformation is a slow burn for many organisations, so it's not going to be, an overnight thing. But we need to understand, particularly for me, it's around focusing on the mundane tasks, getting data and information to people they can trust and rely on. Because then if you can sort out the behind the scene things, and you can start working out, how can we make our business more efficient? Actually, suddenly you've made quite a leap forward, which you can then subsequently build on. Rather than scaring people with, we're going to do absolutely everything by tomorrow. It's got to be a slower burn.
So it's carrying on that evolutionary journey, but also thinking about the organisation as a machine and where do you tune that?
Yes.
Yeah, good, interesting. And Neil, I mean, arguably you represent the oldest profession here. What about transformation and trying to what are your thoughts there about how to sell that message and get it appropriate?
Yeah, for us, part of the answer and one of the critical success factors will be working with citizens more. So I've touched on that briefly, and the whole co-production. You've got to remember, we are the National Health Service, so we're there to provide a service to everyone in the country. We've got a lot of diversity in our country, and we've got people who want to interact with us in lots of different ways. So we have to be very cognizant of that, and we will therefore work with a wide range of different people to co-produce the way that we deliver our services. One thing that I have learned when I was working for a local authority was that by providing things in a great digital and data way, that actually gives you the opportunity to spend more time with other people that aren't able to do it in that way. And therefore, by creating the efficiencies and productivity gains and allowing people to access health service from 8 o'clock in the evening from their own sofa or wherever it is, then that gives us opportunity to reuse our capacity for many vulnerable people. It's quite surprising if you look at the metrics within our area. We've still got upwards of around 15 to 20% of people are digitally excluded in some shape or form. So I recognise that not everyone sees that, because some of us are quite privileged in our education and also in our financial circumstance. There are many people that aren't. So as well as that, working with citizens, it will also be then working with our partners, because the NHS needs to work very closely with a wide range of partners, and some of those are from the public service, and some of those are from private industry, some are from the third sector, voluntaries, etc. And I think that's another part of the critical success factor, understanding how others will also do digital transformation and doing something that works effectively as a cohesive system.
That's good. So it's kind of opening engagement, tackle the low-hanging fruit. If you're dealing with the low-hanging fruit, that gives you the time to work on the higher fruit. So yeah, really good. Thank you.
No, I think that's a really good point you made there, actually, Neil. And it's probably an underrated advantage of digital transformation, in that it frees you up to actually have a very effective hybrid model of digital and human-to-human interaction, and there's that opportunity cost that you're releasing there. I think that's probably underrated, but very good point. I'm going to go back to we had a question came in from Jenny Andrews when we were talking about technology versus data. And Jenny is very interested in this, and she asks, does the panel have any tips for someone in a brand new head of data role who is negotiating relationships with an established IT function? Obviously, she's asking on behalf of a friend. So who would like to offer Jenny some advice first there? Karen, do you want to go first?
It does make me smile, really, because I can recall a meeting where I think I was the only woman in a room for about 16 men from the IT department talking about. So we're looking at a new system, and we drew the new system, and everything came out of the system. And I said, but what about everything that's going in? You're not even thinking about everything that's going in. And it was a sort of shock horror. And I can remember one of the guys said, but we never think about data until the end. Just, well, is that not?
Raised eyebrows from the panel.
And and I think for me, part of this is helping people to understand that data has a life, and technology, it will only be, technology and will only exist for a period of time, but the data will last much longer. So we need to see almost a sort of an IT being like a snail's shell, but it's going to be a home for a period of time, but it's going to grow, it's going to transform, and it needs to be something else. But the snail still survives, but it just has a different shell. And I think, from my experience, it is thinking about that whole life and helping people to understand that journey.
Thank you, Neil. What advice would you give to a new head of data dealing with a gnarly old IT department? Neil.
I would take that person out and show them how to make a difference and why it is making a difference. It's quite interesting, really, because quite often those head of ITs don't actually own the data within the organization. It can quite often sit in a different part of the organization. And I think by taking them and showing them the real benefits it can provide, and to give them that opportunity, then that is what will change mindsets.
Okay, another great answer. So actually going out and seeing how things work in the real world. So I can certainly relate back to that from my early days of going from the technical world and actually walking around the business and understanding and seeing how the data and how the systems were used in practice. That certainly gave me great insight. Yeah, Stuart, what would your advice be to a brand new head of data?
I absolutely recognise this challenge. Both great answers from Karen and Neil, and it's about communication. So typically, a lack of understanding of what aspects that's taking place or what research that's taking place in the laboratory setting that's generating the data. What is the measurement? What is the experimentation that's taking place? And if you take that individual around the labs or whatever work environment you are in, just so they can get a better understanding of where the data has been generated, what ownership there is of the data, what challenges are faced by those individuals, then you can begin to build that better understanding of making sure that IT functions are thinking about the data as an input at the very beginning, rather than, like Karen suggested, that it's an afterthought at the very end, to try and move away from that mindset. But there's also something that can be done back the other way in terms of communication. So we regularly used to have the challenge where a science project would kick off and terabytes of data would be kicked out through imaging projects on a regular basis. And then people would wonder why IT was struggling with data storage issues and how they were going to deal with that data flow. And then wonder why it was a challenge, because they'd not actually taken the time to go and ask the question, where's the data going to be stored, and in what way, how is it going to be secured, what network access is needed and required. And so you build up this two-way conversation. So you get people in the environment where the data is being generated, get them understanding how the data has been created, and then what the curation challenges and requirements are, but then get people feeding back into those IT teams that future requirements, why it's needed, and generate an interest in the particular projects that are taking place. And I think that communication then builds a stronger relationship.
I've probably got two things to throw in there. So first one is kind of re-emphasizing what Karen was saying, is that I think there's got to be a balance between people, process, technology and data, particularly the fact that the data will outlive the technology many times over in most situations. So there's got to be that balanced focus. But the other one is going back to the age-old concept in IT of garbage in, garbage out. And I'm sure many people are now starting to see that it's actually seeming to be a bit more like garbage in, gospel out, because they've got the view that we spent this fortune on this bit of technology, the answer must be right, mustn't it? And they miss the fact that if the input is not fit for purpose, doesn't matter what you do in the middle, the output will be useless. And doesn't matter how shiny it is. And I guess also, Stuart, with your data science background, you probably see some of your colleagues in the profession do some very shiny stuff, but actually what's underneath it all, the answer maybe isn't as good as it should be. So yeah, it's about getting that balance right.
Absolutely. Just to quickly pick up on that, and Mark made the point about infrastructure, no longer seeing like it's a technology focus. Well, I think we've shifted a little bit to the tools. So there's that mindset now really prevalent in machine learning and AI. It's just that it'll fix all of your problems and challenges for you, and you don't have to worry about data quality that is put into those algorithms. And I think we've got to get away from that mindset as well, that's not a solution.
Yeah, I think we haven't got time for my war stories about trying to introduce an AI system with poor data. But anyway, we're running up to the end of our allotted time. So before we completely finish, Alex, I don't know if you're ready to just do a very quick screen share of your work today. So Alex has been working his best trying to keep up with the discussion to just show a little bit of visually show the debate as it's been. So yeah, so there's all sorts of things there coming through, garbage in, gospel out, that last bit there, the data science rock stars, IT is like a snail shell. Yeah, some really good things there that we're going to be sharing with the speakers, and for those who are members of BCS and DAMA, they'll be shared through later on that. So thank you for that, Alex. There's obviously a little bit more polishing to do on that, but it's been, I think, a really useful addition to the week. So on behalf of the BCS and the Data Management Specialist Group, I'd like to thank you for joining in this week. I'd like to thank our speakers. We've had some really, really excellent sessions. The recordings will be available shortly. So on behalf of me and the BCS, thank you very much. Mark?
Yeah, on behalf of DAMA UK, I'd also like to thank especially our state speakers, but everyone who's attended the sessions. And as Julian says, the sessions have all been recorded, so if you have missed any, then they'll be available on catch up. There's certainly a number that I haven't been able to see, which I'm looking forward to following when I have some free time. So no, thank you very much to everyone who's participated.
Yep, thank you all. Bye for us.